instead of in a high school, in a cult with a bunch of racists and bigots and authoritarians. So it's like an authoritarian 1990s rom-com where Marjorie Taylor Greene is the reasonable figure in this arrangement. She is very upset that Donald Trump is flirting politically or perhaps otherwise with Laura Lumer, who is perhaps the only MAGA cultist who would make somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene look kind of chill. So for context, Laura Lumer, who is not a Republican congressperson, she ran for office and lost badly. She is a MAGA influencer, and she's very devoted to Donald Trump. And she is also a bigot. She says incendiary things all the time. The vice president posts a thing on Twitter celebrating National Grandparents' Day, and she talks about her South Asian grandparents. And then Laura Lumer responds with this really unhinged racist screed talking about if Kamala wins the presidency, the White House is going to came out of nowhere and was like, as Marjorie Taylor Greene has said, it's kind of like the pot calling the kettle black. But then this triggered a whole meltdown in MAGA world. The thing is that Trump's doubled down on it. Trump was asked about this during a press conference or a campaign event in California yesterday, and he was asked about it repeatedly by multiple reporters. And he's like, "Listen, Laura Lumer, she's a free spirit, and she's really devoted." And so he just doubled down on his association with Lumer, even though multiple Republicans, not just Green, are coming out of the woodwork and just begging him, "Please, for the love of God, let her go." He won't, man.
Yeah,
talking about. He's well known as a man who really respects and honors his marriage vows, and not at all a philanderer. Would never stray from Melania, who clearly loves him and enjoys his company. I mean, yeah, I wouldn't be stunned. I wouldn't be shocked at all. Donald Trump, in all seriousness, set his libido aside. The thing that drives Donald Trump more than anything at 78 years old is this unconditional devotion to him. And I think in this election cycle, he's seeing, even people like Marjorie Taylor Greene sometimes defy him. It's happened a couple of times. As a matter of fact, with her feud with Speaker Mike Johnson, Laura Lumer is that sort of person who is come hell or high water, at least so far, she's got Trump's back. And I think that is arousing to Trump in ways that nothing else is. So I wouldn't be stunned or surprised at all if they had some sort of relationship. Bro, yes. Yeah. I mean, and she's flying on Trump Force One, yeah. And she's been to Mar-a-Lago a gazillion times, and we never see Melania anymore. That's true. And she did release a video, talking about, it was kind of in defense of Trump, but it was so stone cold. You could tell she was reading it under duress. If the camera panned back, there was probably someone holding a gun to her. And I'm just say the words, Melania. But even the second video, when I mean she was defending Trump, it was all on paper. She does not speak about Trump in a way that somebody who loves their spouse would, and understandably so. If you've met Trump, I imagine he's pretty hard to love. So I want to be clear. I don't think she's trying to overcompensate or whatever. I think anytime she goes out in defense of Donald, if she shows up at the RNC or whatever, I think it's under duress. I think it is to satisfy terms of a contract. I think if she'd probably be anywhere else on earth if she could. But yeah, all these pieces coming together, it does suggest something horrid. But even if not, it's just really stupid politically. I mean, Donald Trump seems to be under the impression, I know because you debate a lot of MAGA cultists, they seriously believe that Trump is much more popular than what he is, and that he has a margin for error. He simply doesn't. Donald Trump's base is galvanized. They're motivated. There's very little deviation. He's always hovering at 43% support, but he has never been popular. He's never cracked, not once, 50% approval rating, and that even after he got shot. So this idea that he can just gallivant around with whomever he wants and there will be no political consequences is just ridiculous. And so I don't know. I genuinely think he is spiraling in a way we've never seen from him before, and we've seen some pretty crazy shit from him. So it's interesting. So my understanding is that the First Lady of the United States, which by the way isn't even referenced in the Constitution, it's just the spouse of, if the president is married, the spouse is the First Lady or the First Gentleman. Now, Governor Gavin, you got to think about it. So states they have their own mini presidents, governors, and governors have spouses and partners. And so, for example, Governor Gavin Newsom is unmarried. He's dating a woman, and she is the first partner of California. So it's whoever the significant other of the chief executive is in the absence of a marriage. But if there have been unmarried presidents, I'm sure there have, I don't remember who the hell they are. So like, it's just part of that tradition. But yeah, isn't that terrifying to think that there could be a divorce and then there could be a first partner, Laura Lumer, God, can you imagine like the White House? She could have a position in the White House. I mean, we talked about this before, maybe not the DOJ specifically, but like she could be press secretary. She could be communications director. True. She could be senior advisor. She could be White House chief of staff. We talked about that role. It's so fascinating. It's effectively the second most powerful role in the federal government, requires it's listed nowhere in the Constitution, requires no Senate confirmation. You don't even have to make them acting chief of staff because it's not like you have to work around the Senate. You could have a chief of staff, Laura Lumer. I'll also say, while you were talking, it occurred to me, Luke Beasley interviewed Laura Lumer, and I'm just thinking to myself, if Luke has interviewed someone that crazy, I feel like you should interview her. I feel like that would be such a good conversation. She'd do it. If you reach out to Laura Lumer, she'd have that conversation. Would you interview Stephen Bunnell that you've ever talked to, or no? Stories for the week. Obviously, what's going on in Springfield, Ohio. I don't even know if that in and of itself, the influx of migrants to Springfield, Ohio would necessarily be national news, except for the fact that Donald Trump made it national news because he's spreading this conspiracy theory that Haitian migrants are eating the cats, the dogs. And obviously it's bullshit. There's no evidence for it. He was fact-checked on it, but he will not let it die. And as a consequence of this, stunner when a former president of the United States, potentially the future president of the United States and leader of one of two major political parties, talks about this stuff, there are ripple effects. And as a consequence, there have been an influx of bomb threats to public buildings, including schools. Schools had to be, there's reports had to be taken into the gym to discuss bomb threats, and there were school cancellations as well. I had heard that there is some credible reporting about that, but there was also credible reporting that another source of the rumor was a woman who made a post on Facebook about a neighbor's cat being eaten by a Haitian migrant, and that story had been told to the neighbor who owned the cat, third party. So it's like this weird chain of custody as far as like the story goes. They interviewed the woman who put up the Facebook story. She deleted the post. She is emotional. She's upset. She goes, "It was not that I was told, so I just talked about it on social media." She said people have gone wild with it. They're demonizing Haitians. It's led to bomb threats and mass panic, and I disavow the whole thing. I'm so sorry. I deleted the post. So I feel like this is one of those stories where it's going to be really hard to trace the single origin point of it. Sounds like it's one of those things where it's like there are multiple, contemporaneous conspiracy theories popping up. But yeah, I did hear that about the neo-Nazi giving the speech, and going back to me, what is the broader issue besides demonizing immigrants is the lack of consequences and just the asymmetry. This is something that on my content, my channel, I talk about a lot because I do think it's not necessarily the immediate problem, but it represents a long-term problem with the political structure in our country, kind of like the Supreme Court, which is the last story that I want to bring to your attention. But we can't have a system, we can't have a truly functioning system where we evaluate two candidates, two sides, two political parties, two movements by different standards. Like, my call to conservatives and centrists when I have conversations with them, privately or publicly, is pick a fucking standard. Pick one standard. We can disagree on what the standard is. I might think your standard is too loose or too strict, but pick one and hold both sides to it. And what always happens, going back to your many conversations with peers, is the left and Democrats are responsible not only for their rhetoric and the rhetoric of their fringe, but also in some ways even conservative rhetoric. Like, it's actually Joe Biden's fault that Donald Trump has said these unhinged things, because perhaps if we didn't bully Donald Trump as much as apparently we have, he wouldn't be tempted to say this radical shit. Yeah, it is a long-term threat to any sort of political cohesion. Set aside principled disagreements. Like, we can't even have those or litigate those if we have wildly different standards based on who happens to be, president or what's politically convenient. I mean, you go to the Watergate example because Republican President Richard Nixon was kind of the poster child for political corruption before Donald Trump. And you look at how Republicans handled that. They were obviously biased towards Nixon, but it was Republicans who went to President Nixon and said, hey, listen, you need to resign by tomorrow, because if you don't, Democrats will have the votes to impeach you, and they're going to have enough votes from us, Republicans, to convict you in the Senate. So, no, and that's why I'm not convinced that if he loses this election, I'm still not convinced that there's going to be a grand epiphany yet, because the Trump alphabet, I say, is 25 L's and 1 W. He won once in 2016, and it's just been a string of defeats electorally ever since he became the leader of the party. I think that as long as he's alive and as long as he chooses to exercise some, activity within politics, they're screwed. I think they have to wait until he passes away, or until, like, if he loses this next election and he says, you know what, fuck it, I'm done. I'm going to go the way of President Bush and just go down to Texas and finger paint, which is all George Bush does now. If he does that, then I think the Republicans will have room to emancipate themselves from him. But otherwise, no, I think this is it until he finally passes away. The last thing I'll say on this is, you use the example of the 2020 election theft claims about how they create the atmosphere of election denialism, and then they appeal to it when arguing with Democrats, like, hey, listen, there has to be something here, there's potentially something here, otherwise people wouldn't feel this way. And it kind of reminds me, like, in 2016, if you look at the polls, a lot of Democrats felt that the election was stolen by Trump and Russia. Now, I would argue that's not because Democrats were arguing that. It's not like Hillary Clinton was coming out and saying that. It was because Trump was publicly inviting Russia to meddle in our elections, right? But the point is this. By that standard, the Democrats should have demanded that we audit the election, that we contest the election, that Hillary should have tried to sue her way into the White House, that we should have had recounts, we should have tossed it back to the House of Representatives, we should have had alternate slate of electors. Like, by that same standard, Hillary Clinton had every right to do everything Donald Trump did in 2020 and 2016 because, well, people had doubts about the election. The problem is these MAGA cultists are so unprincipled. They're such losers. It's like, no, that doesn't count. You don't get to question the 2016 election. Donald Trump was the duly elected president. No doubts about it whatsoever. Fuck your feelings. It doesn't matter if you doubted it. But in 2020, well, it's different. And that's where to me, when you have conversations with people who doubt the election, I think it's important to say, did you doubt the 2016 election? Do you wish we could have gone back and audited that election? Will you commit today that if any Democrat has doubts about the 2024 election in the event Trump wins, that you will commit to audits and recounts and alternate slates of electors and all that shit? And if the answer, of course, is no, because they're just authoritarians who want their cultists to win. Right. So it's like all that matters as long as they have a little R next to their name. I mean, it's so I have such contempt for it, and I know you do too. The fallout from this debate has been extraordinary. All the post-debate polls have come in, and it's not looking good for Trump. Simon Rosenberg is a Democratic operative who tracks this stuff pretty closely. It's just one L after another for Donald Trump. Down 3 points, down 5 points, down 6 points, depending on the poll. Now, he is convinced, Stephen, that he won the debate. Is what he's telling everybody. I won the debate. All the polls say so, 92-8. That's what everyone says. But curiously, he's not wanting a rematch. He is publicly saying in speeches and on Truth Social, he's pinned it, that he will not have a second debate with the vice president. So I think that's the single big. So it's funny. I don't think so. I think with Donald Trump, number one, pathological liar par excellence. We've everyone says politicians lie, and I suppose there's some truth to that, but it's a huge difference in degree with Donald Trump. I think the moment he gets desperate enough and believes that a third debate is necessary, second debate rather, second with Kamala, third debate total, is necessary for him to win, I think he'll just absolutely do. Pull a switcheroo on this. And as a matter of fact, some people are saying that this is a classic Trump negotiating tactic, man. He's like, no, listen, I don't need it. I'm not interested, waiting for a more lucrative offer. But I will say a lot of MAGA Republicans have gone on the record and prior specifically to his refusal to have a second debate with her, saying that he needed to have a second debate with her. So you grew up in the neocon era. You know who Bill O'Reilly is. Bill O'Reilly is no longer on Fox, but he has his own website. He's a frequent contributor on News Nation. He was a guest on Piers Morgan, good buddy of yours. And he told Piers and others, he's like, listen, Trump needs, he goes, the vice president should not have a second debate. She got lucky. She just needs to take her victory and go home. But Donald Trump needs a second debate. And then Trump came out and said what he said. So I think there's a lot of discordance in the MAGA camp at the moment, because you also quoted Trump when he was like, prize fighters who lose fights, they demand a rematch. I'm not going to do that. But what was funny was when Trump beat Biden, President Biden, in their debate, at least that was the conventional wisdom, that he beat him, not that Biden just defeated himself, but that Trump beat him. Trump's logic just shifts from day to day. He said he won the debate. He demanded a rematch. Now he's saying he won this debate, and then only losers demand rematches. I don't know. I think with him, you just can't expect anything. I would not be surprised if in 2 days he says, you know what, on second thought, I think a third debate would be, or second debate would be really, really important to make our case to the American people. The American people want to hear from us. And so I would love to have a debate with Comrade Kamala on Fox News. Last story I saw, and I actually saw it this morning, is President Biden appointed Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson as his one Supreme Court appointee. And they asked her about the Trump immunity decision and the idea that in her dissent, she called it a 5-alarm fire. And I know this is something that you're passionate about, something I'm passionate about. And she talks about it a bit in this interview, that it's a high stakes decision. She believes it was a disastrous decision. And so I just think it's interesting that Supreme Court justices are not only willing to write about it in dissents, but they're willing to go on the record in front of a camera to a major news network and say, yeah, shit's fucked.
But
well, could I just say on that subject,
yeah,
this is so important. It goes to your first point. The fact that he was the Senate Judiciary Chairman, Biden could have said, as the Senate Judiciary Chairman, if there is a vacancy under President Bush in his last year in office, we will not hold a hearing. He could have thrown that big energy around. He could have done that and said, I'm the guy who actually makes this decision. I'm telling you this is the way it's going to be. He didn't even go that far, Stephen. So to me, that totally kneecaps their point. They would have more of a point if Biden used his power to make a hard commitment the way that Mitch McConnell and the Republicans did, that we're going to do X, Y, and Z. But he didn't. He said, maybe this is a good idea. I'm sorry. Go ahead. That's a great point. I didn't think about that either. Yeah. So he's basically leaving it on the table like, hey, no matter what the outcome of the election is, maybe after the election, if there's a vacancy, because the Constitution empowers the incumbent president, even if they lose an election, to fill a vacancy, we'll do it then, but maybe not in the lead up before. Sure, I think that's a really good point. And I know the Supreme Court reform is something that's important. And it's become important to you. It's been important to me for some time. But I think conversations about this court are really, really important. And I'm curious, last question for you. Do you think that Democrats will or should make Supreme Court reform more of an issue in this election, given its unpopularity, given people's frustrations with it, or do you think it would be a bad political idea? Yeah, you want to systematize it, makes it's less high stakes, it's less like Russian roulette. I totally agree that the frequency of regularity, I think, would be just more stabilizing for the country as a whole. And I think then it would also have a stabilizing effect on elections too. So like if you know that every election cycle you cast your ballot and there's a high probability, or there's a constitutional guarantee because of these term limits, that the person you vote for will at least get 2 shots at the title. I think that'd be a really good idea. Well, the only thing that I know immediately is that right now the Republican-led House of Representatives is struggling amongst themselves internally. They have to pass a shutdown again. We have a continuing resolution that's set to expire. As you know, this has been a political vulnerability and just like a procedural vulnerability for Republicans, because they made a deal with President Biden last year for a full budget. They reneged on the deal. They lost a speaker. No, 100%. They kicked out their own guy. It was an historic. Kevin McCarthy said he wanted to be an historic speaker, and goddamn it, he nailed it. Check. But this is still the problem, because there are some moderate Republicans who recognize we got to keep the lights on, and if we don't, historically speaking, Republicans have been punished electorally. One time that the American electorate is sane, Historically speaking, when Republicans shut down the government, they usually suffer consequences in the polls and in elections. The one time when Americans have their eyes on the prize, like, yeah, this is their fault because they're the ones who do it, instead of blaming just whoever happens to be president. However, you have the far right flank in the House of Representatives who are like, no, Democrats better give us every goddamn thing we ask for. Otherwise, we're going to shut the whole thing down. Trump is calling for that as well. And so Mike Johnson is kind of screwed. He's in a rock and a hard place because he just doesn't have the numbers to do that. He will eventually have to turn to Democrats to keep the government funded, in which case, as far as I'm concerned, Democrats should break it off in him by demanding concession after concession after concession to help him clean up his mess. But that's still ongoing, and there's a lot of tension right now in the House Republican Party. So we may have a government shutdown right before an election. Yeah, I appreciate it, man.
There was a bombshell indictment dropped by the Justice Department alleging a Russian propaganda campaign that was specifically using well-known creators to spread certain Russian talking points and to fund specifically the creation of videos or content related to pro-Russian narratives, or at least destabilizing narratives.
Ukraine is the enemy, and we should apologize to Russia.
The indictment alleged 2 counts against 2 individuals, persons that were employees for RT. RT was used to be known as Russia Today, is considered by the Justice Department and by the United States government to be sort of a wing of the Russian state, and certainly connected to or in league with the aims of the Russian government. What the fact pattern is that 2 individuals who we now understand to be Lauren Chen and her husband, they were approached by these Russian individuals, and that there was an agreement, a conspiracy at the very least, to bring on other content creators, allegedly unwittingly, according to the government, and pay them these exorbitant rates, perhaps unknowingly, but for the purpose of facilitating their spreading of the message. The RT individuals coordinated with Lauren Chen and Liam Donovan. They helped them in terms of logistics, gave editing advice, gave even content direction at times. I encourage everyone to read the statute about what was alleged. The counts relate to a conspiracy to violate. There's this impression that all foreign interference or all foreign influence is illegal. That's not true. There's an impression that all advocacy on behalf of a foreign nation is illegal. That's not true. Or that all advocacy promoting a foreign nation is illegal. That's not true. The context in which this often comes up in are organizations like AIPAC, organizations which promote the interest of American-Israeli relations and strong promotion of Israel's security and that kind of thing. Also, additionally, people who are advocating for Ukrainian interests in the United States. There are also people who allege that Hunter Biden violated Farah in certain ways. In recent history, there have been accusations and, in fact, indictments related to certain people connected to Trump. Paul Manafort, there was a famous Farah indictment. Number one, understand that Farah is specifically targeting the registration of foreign agents of foreign principles. So, number one, recognize that it's about registration. It's not about stopping all foreign influence. We just want the American people to be put on notice when you are an agent of a foreign principle to name yourself and to out yourself. I think that's right. And I think that people should realize the founding of the country, one of the biggest fears of our framers was, in fact, foreign influence. One of the purposes behind our union and for it to be a vigorous government was to resist sometimes the foreign tendency to break apart the binds of the several states. That was one of the explicit fears. And in fact, we had a lot of fear-mongering in the early days about French involvement, British involvement, and a lot of looking behind and under rocks and corners to see who was the foreigner trying to influence things, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. If you remember George Washington's speech, he very much worried about entangling relationships and influences from overseas. And so at times you can maybe argue that it's maybe too vigorous or too much, but this is a founding principle or fear of our government, is to out foreign influence. And I agree it needs to be balanced by certain First Amendment interests, and that much is true. But also notice the other part to FARA, which is it doesn't ban all speech that could incidentally help another country, or even all speech that is in the interest of another country. It's about foreign agents, and that means a particular thing. An agency relationship means a particular type of thing. And so I want to go over, with our last little bit of time here, some of the key terms in the FARA statute. And first, I'm going to define for you the term person in FARA, which is different than you might think. And this is actually true across many different statutory schemes in the United States. You need to look at the definition sections, because sometimes a definition can be broader than you think. So, for example, the term person under FARA includes any individual, partnership, association, corporation, organization, or any other combination of individuals. That's what a person means. And notice with the next term that we're going to use, foreign principal. That includes 3 different categories. A government of a foreign country, and by government, which is further defined in FARA, what's meant is any person, as defined in the broad way, or group of persons exercising sovereign de facto or de jure political jurisdiction over any country other than the United States, or over any part of such country, which includes any subdivision of any such group, and any group or agency to which such sovereign de facto or de jure authority or function are directly or indirectly delegated. So it's also and there's additional terms as well. It's a very broad definition of government that would include, for instance, a foreign State Department, a foreign or a foreign ministry in that case, or a foreign intelligence agency. You mentioned that because the next part of the definition of government of a foreign country is such terms shall also include any faction or body of insurgents within a country assuming to exercise governmental authority, whether such faction or body of insurgents has or has not been recognized by the United States. And so this is a broad definition to include all sorts of government actors or pseudo-government actors, or even insurgents claiming to have governmental authority. So the first category of foreign principles are the kind of traditional governments of foreign countries and foreign political parties, which we're not talking about as much, but that would include things like the Party of Regions in the case of the Manafort indictment, where he was allegedly working on behalf of the Party of Regions. Now, it just so happened to be that Party of Regions, which was the Russia pro-aligned party of Yanukovych, that was also the government in charge, but it need not be. So that's the first category of. Notice, even under this definition, RT, if it could be proved, and I think it can reasonably be proved, if they were exercising or being delegated authority by the Russian government, it would fall under government of a foreign country. So we already have RT included probably in the definition of government of a foreign country. But even if you don't accept that RT would be under that definition, the second category of foreign principle means a person outside of the United States, unless it is established that such person is an individual and a citizen of and domiciled within the United States, or that such a person is not an individual and is organized under or created by the laws of the United States or of any state or other place subject to the jurisdiction of the United States and has its principal place of business within the United States. All this means is basically all foreigners living outside of the country, all organizations organized outside of the country are also foreign principles. So, for example, if there is a business, a foreign business, let's say call it Burisma, organized under the laws of Ukraine, it's not the government of the Ukraine. It's not a political party in Ukraine, but it is a person outside of the United States, and so it would be considered a foreign principle. Again, very broad. There's going to be a way we're going to narrow this in a little bit, but understand so far that the term foreign principle is going to grab a lot of things. And the third category of foreign principles is any partnership, association, corporation, organization, or other combination of persons organized under the laws of or having its principal place of business in a foreign country. And so already, and you can ask if you have any questions, you understand foreign principle to be including all sorts of individuals. And even in the indictment, if you guys recall, Edward Gregorian is this alleged French person or living in Paris. He would be a foreign principal under this definition because he is a person outside of the United States and he is not a citizen and is domiciled in the United States. I think it's a good point. And it's a good point right now to let's put in, for example, because I see this example being used, and without any views on the conflict in Israel or Gaza or what's going on here, but just to apply it, because I know this is an example that's being used. use APAC so far in our definition. APAC is not a foreign principle so far because APAC is not a government or foreign country. It's not a foreign political party. It's not a person outside the United States. It's not a partnership, association, corporation, organization, or combination of persons outside the United States. So we know that APAC is not a foreign principle. Now, Israel is a foreign principle. Israel is a government of a foreign country, but APAC is not Israel. And so in order to have this one-to-one comparison, again, without having any views on the conflict or anything like that, just for purposes of Farah, you're now going to have to get into the meat and potatoes of what it means to be an agent of a foreign principle. And so the question is going to be, were these two were Lauren Chen and Liam Donovan, as alleged in the indictment, which it is alleged in the indictment that they were acting as agents of the foreign principle. Keeping this in mind, the indictment says there was a conspiracy. The conspiracy was between the RT employees, and the conspiracy was to cause Liam Donovan and Lauren Chen to act as foreign agents. And so the indictment necessarily, even though it doesn't charge Lauren Chen, it doesn't charge Liam Donovan, the indictment does allege a conspiracy, one of the elements of which is causing Lauren Chen and causing Liam Donovan to be agents of a foreign principle.
No.
There could be a lot of different things, or maybe there's less culpability here. And I want to be clear, I'm not alleging that they were indicted, but what I am alleging is that the conspiracy inherently involves causing them to act as agents of a foreign principle. And so now we're going to see, apply it both to Lauren Chen and Liam Donovan, and then also apply it to our APAC example, which is going in the news, again, without having any view on the conflict itself. And this is the definition of agent of a foreign principle. And it means, under the Farah statute, any person who acts as an agent, representative, employee, or servant, or any person who acts in any other capacity at the order, request, or under the direction or control of a foreign principle, that is what we just defined, or of a person, any of whose activities are directly or indirectly supervised, directed, controlled, financed, or subsidized in whole or in major part by a foreign principle, and who directly or through any other person does the following three sets of things. So the number one component of this is, are you first an agent? And that means you're being controlled. Now there's actually a split of authority. I won't go in too much in depth about what the exact level of control needs to be. Different courts have different ideas. For example, the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, which is not necessarily binding on the whole country, has the kind of traditional restatement agency. Restatement is kind of the body of law. It's the traditional test of agency, which is like, do you have consent to be controlled by another? You can think of that more in a contractual sense, but maybe not directly contractual. So the Third Circuit has one approach on what the level of control needs to be under FARA. The Second Circuit has a broader approach. You don't need to be consent to being controlled. Maybe you just need to be in between commanded and begged to do something, and it's a kind of a more nebulous test with less control needed. But just to let you guys know that there's some disagreement. But in this particular example, say for example Lauren Chen and Liam Donovan's case, they were being paid, they were being controlled, they were being directed. When you see the indictment, they're asking permission to hire people. That sounds like a master agent. Who's the master and who's the agent? Who's the one working on behalf of whom? Who's asking for money from the Russians? Who's invoicing the Russians for services rendered? That's why it's a very clear case in Liam and Lauren's situation that there is an agency relationship. Okay, so they are agents in the agency sense, but are they agents of a foreign principle for purposes of FARA? Because, okay, they're getting paid, but are they doing covered activities that would bring them into FARA? And so the last part of this definition to close off on, of the three things that are in this kind of subsection for agent of a foreign principle, you can either, one, engage within the United States, within the country of the United States, in political activities for or in the interest of such foreign principle. That's a big one, okay? So if you are engaging in quote unquote political activities for or in the interest of the foreign principle. So you have to ask yourself, right? If it is the case that Lauren Chen and Liam Donovan were in the United States engaging in political activity in the interest of RT or Russia, right? So keep in mind, you could consider the foreign principle to be either the Russian state, or you could consider it to be RT, or you could even consider it to be the fake persona Edward Gregorian. If you were engaging in political activity for Edward Gregorian, then you're going to be covered by Farah. And there's an additional definition of political activities that we won't get into, but it essentially has to do with, is your intent to change policy of the United States or of the several states? And so it's not necessarily going to cover all the businesses, right? So if you're on behalf of a foreign country or a foreign principal coming in to do some business, you're coming here to sell widgets, okay? You're not going to be doing political activity. It's not going to be covered by FARA. It's for people who do political activities. The second little subsection is acting as a PR counsel, publicity agent, information service employee, or political consultant for or in the interests of a foreign principal within the United States. This is the third one now. Sorry, there's four. Collecting, soliciting, dispersing, or dispensing contributions, loans, monies, or other things of values in the interest of the foreign principal, or four, within the United States, representing the interests of such foreign principals before any agency or official of the government of the United States. And that's just a few of the different ways in which you could violate FARA and act as an agent of a foreign principal. Notice that it's tailored to, one, an agency relationship. So there's a direct kind of master-servant relationship, and it's pretty targeted towards political activities for or in the interest of the foreign principal. That's how you're going to narrow a lot of these cases and get to the distinguishing between like AIPAC, let's say. So let's think about AIPAC. Can you prove that there's an agency relationship between AIPAC and Israel? It's not enough to show that they have interests that are aligned. You need to actually show that they're being controlled, directed, financed, or everything else in the agency relationship that we have in order to bring them under FARA. Maybe you can make that case, but it's one that you would have to allege before you're going to allege a double standard. But however, I think it's pretty clear based on the facts in the indictment, if you accept them, they are just allegations, but if you accept them, that it would be covered, that the conduct of Lauren Chen and Liam Donovan. And so I encourage all of you, if you're having these conversations, to always track back to the statute and remember that FARA is both narrower and broader than what people think. At its maximal, you could say that interpretation of FARA could cover a lot of things that you don't want it to cover, but it's harder to make that argument if you're not aware about what the terms are, what they mean. So stay informed and stay woke.
Okay.
You might have heard that Ukraine has invaded Russia recently, last month. Okay. And it seems like Russia wants to defend their sacred territory, and they have decided that they're going to try and reclaim the Kursk region, at least according to there, but they were overwhelmed very, very quickly. The HIMARS were very useful in stopping reinforcements from coming in as well. And Russia didn't really respond all that much. There was a bit of reinforcement, but it didn't really achieve like an emergency, we've just been at our border penetrated response, which some people didn't expect. A lot of people were expecting that what this might be is Ukraine trying to bait Russia into diverting their forces away from occupied areas in Ukraine to go and save the Kursk region. Now, they didn't do that. And the fear now is that Ukraine has this massive territory, which they intend to hold. They intend to impose military rule over it. And it might be quite difficult to defend because it's all the way into Russia. And it doesn't seem to have achieved like at least that. As far as what Putin's response is, it hasn't been that much yet. It seems to be that what he might do is just try to use like very low troop capacity to try and get it back. He might but just try to throw drones or any kind of like low personnel ways or like artillery strikes and things like that to try and just like shift the defenses or demoralize the troops or to like shake it kind of like over time. According to Ukraine, it's there to stay. According to Russia, Putin said he's going to try to get back, but there's not really any signs so far of any massive diversion of troops away. There have been some movements away from Kherson, Zaporizhia, but definitely not as much Donbass. So they don't want to overextend. It seems to be that they've been more or less the same for the last few weeks with that, the number I keep seeing is 800 square miles. So yeah, they are intent on They're intent on digging in. They're intent on imposing military rule over the area and holding it for as long as they can. The only issue is it just doesn't seem to have so far caused any kind of weakening of Russian defenses in the Donbass. For Ukraine, that's not really a massive issue just yet. They've managed to conscript a lot more people through their new laws that came in just a few months ago. Their defenses are pretty solidified where they are. But it seems to be that Russia or Putin has decided that Ukraine territory is too big to fail. Like, he doesn't really want to risk losing any of that to try and get the Kursk region back now. But I think he's threatening to test nuclear weapons in Russia. I don't know if he means to do that in Kursk, or probably just do like a nuclear test somewhere where there's no one actually there to hit. But him saying that is very different from him doing it, because he said it enough times now. So as far as the Russian response itself, I don't actually know how it's affected like local morale or anything. It's really difficult to gauge any Russian opinion too hard on the war because of all the censorship that goes on there. I think one of the predictions is that it might be a bit like, if Putin is intent on trying to get it back, the fact is that it would just be really like a morale thing, because like the whole fear of just losing that region. And the thing with Russia is that they seem to be a little bit arbitrary in terms of the way that they tried to contain losses, because there was a big battle in 2023 for the Krinky village across the Dnieper River, which I've definitely pronounced incorrectly, where Russia prioritized retaking this village that didn't really have any strategic importance, or very low, and they suffered massive losses as a result of that. That was, similar things to what Prigozhin was screaming about, with a bunch of people just getting thrown in like sacks of meat towards a very unimportant area. So far, it seems like the predictions are more or less correct, that they're trying to contain this with like minimal troops and more just kind of like aviation, which probably wouldn't be great for Kyiv, because it means that they just have to suffer damage in this place that they're occupying without the Russians expending that much in terms of manpower. Estimates are that they'll need about 50,000 people to try and take Kursk back.
Damn. Okay.
It was just yesterday Putin announced that his intent is to fight back for Kursk. So we'll probably know within a couple of weeks, or even the next week, what he actually means by that. Is it just going to be them sending over a bunch of UAVs and firing artillery from a distance, or are they actually going to gather troops? Ukrainians have said that there are 30,000 troops going into the Kursk region. Estimates are that they need 50,000, but like if that is actually true and they start going like quite hard for it, then yeah, that's going to be a pretty grim battle, I think.
Okay.
Because Ukraine does not want to lose that. Like, their international support and their morale depends quite strongly now on that area, because things were not going that well lately for that. So there's been quite a lot. There's been the Philadelphia corridor was secured in Gaza. They've found already 9 tunnels that were going from Gaza into Egypt. Big tunnels. You can fit like a vehicle through them. It's not just like the single file ones that you tend to see in Gaza. They invited a journalist, an international one, in there. A Sky News guy actually got to go through Rafah a little bit. He didn't see all that much because one of the streets that he was on, there was a gunfight happening in the street next to it when he was there. So they're still very restrictive in where they put people. They obviously haven't found every single tunnel in the strip. There's still a lot of insurgency going on, but all the way from Rafah till the corridor, like, Israel has military control over like the perimeter and the border. They showed the journalist that video of they took him to the tunnel that had the hostages, the 6 hostages who got shot. They showed him the tunnel, so the children's bedroom, that all seems to have been real, confirmed by Sky News anyway. But where we go now is a bit difficult, because we don't really know what the Israeli cabinet wants to do next. And even Daniel Hagari is getting interviewed by the Sky journalist when he's in Gaza, and you can tell that Hagari is not too sure about what to say for what's next. He's saying, like, our job is the IDF, we're the soldiers. We just have to secure this area until the cabinet decides what to do next. And then he's trying to pull out kind of any hints about what might happen next. And he's just like, he just keeps answering, it's up to the cabinet. We just have to wait to see what the cabinet says. So
they've gone all up and down the Gaza Strip now, right? There's not like an untouched area that the IDF hasn't waged ground war in, right?
I don't know if they waged a ground war in the Al-Mawasi area, but they've struck it everywhere else. Yeah, they've also pulled troops out of areas as well. So the problem now is that there's a kind of like, at least according to a lot of American analysts, they seem to think that Israel has achieved about as much as they can militarily in terms of overwhelming Hamas. What they have now is basically a game of whack-a-mole, where there's an insurgency pops up here, they take care of it, it goes away, and then comes up here with newly conscripted people, or maybe like just a civilian picks up a gun that they found in the rubble and does that. So that could go on forever. Like that there's no end to that potentially. And that seems to be, we're at the beginning of that. I don't think they want to. It's really because Hezbollah have only gotten stronger since 2006. They've built new civilian towns that are obviously also housing military infrastructure, and those towns are very, very strategic. Like they're in a better position. They're fortified. They've had this constant land corridor to allow Iran to move arms through Iraq, through Syria, into Lebanon. And so they've only been able to dig in even harder since 2006. And we know how the last war went for them. It was horrible. I don't think they want a ground invasion into Lebanon. The only way that that would happen is if Hezbollah, in their efforts to, keep up a good front for the international press, to make it look like they're doing something, to keep on firing their attacks, is like one strike goes maybe a bit too hard, or maybe even they accidentally, like they did in Golan, is one of their strikes misses their target and hits a playground full of kids. Mm-hmm. So like that's the only way where an invasion might get triggered. I don't think it's something that they have any intention of doing, especially given how long Gaza's taken.
Okay.
I'm not even started with Palestine, don't worry. It's kind of interesting to think about what a Harris presidency would be like compared to even Biden's, because we know that Kamala leans closer to the Palestinian side, at least in terms of sympathy and rhetoric and the way she treats Netanyahu and everything else. Obviously, she doesn't want to reveal that much now because there's a whole bunch of moderate Republicans who are moving over to the party, so she can't really appear too left. But I think if she's in a position of power, she probably will push harder than Biden, just because of her positions and also just because of how international attention is going to just stay in that area. And as far as Israelis go, there's a kind of mixed opinion about how susceptible Israelis are to that, because obviously they do need to elect a prime minister for someone to go along with Kamala Harris, like Netanyahu probably won't. There was a survey done by Foreign Affairs on the Israeli public to see how they saw U.S. pressure. And the way they did it was they had control groups where they had a group of people who were not primed at all before being asked questions. There was the other group that was shown a fake story suggesting that Biden is not giving unconditional support and that American opinions are souring towards Israel. And the interesting thing is that when they asked Israelis who had seen that fake story, which is very plausible, they were more likely to support a ceasefire deal. Like it went up from the national average of about 60% to 75-ish. Mm-hmm. And even for Netanyahu voters. So Netanyahu voters who are being shown this potential ceasefire deal would support it, maybe about a quarter of them. But if they heard that it came from U.S. pressure and a lack of unconditional support, they were more likely to go up to 40%. So even when Netanyahu voters hear that there's American pressure and souring opinion, they're more likely to support a ceasefire deal that comes from America. Mm-hmm. So, and I think we noticed this as well when we were there, not from Netanyahu voters, but when we were in the protests in Tel Aviv. I don't know if I even told you about this because it's just people I was talking to, but it was people who I asked them who their idea of a good leader would be for Israel. I expect them to say people like maybe Gallant or maybe Gantz or maybe even Yair Golan, but they didn't say it. They said the first name they came up with. First of all, they're like, well, I don't know. They're lost. And then the first name they came up with in 3 cases was Biden. Someone like Biden.
Interesting.
Like, it's interesting that the Israeli public that has just even an ounce of sympathy for like a peaceful solution or like desire for a peaceful solution, they don't see that in any of their own leaders. They see it in Biden first, like an American president. Mm-hmm. And that's not like lacking in historical precedent. Often, like when Israel gets pushed forward, it's either because of a war or it's because of American pressure, usually both. Mm-hmm. So, yep, and Reagan in the Lebanon war with withholding arms, and even actually, I didn't know this, that Margaret Thatcher, for about 13 or 14 years, actually completely stopped UK arms sales to Israel because of the first Lebanon war. She didn't lift them until after the first Intifada. Listen, that's one step in the right direction. That and the Falklands, everything else, she's still questionable, okay? So it does show that like America has a lot more latitude than it thinks. And seeing that happen with Kamala Harris might be kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the question is for America is like, is there any, I feel like a president at the end of the day is still only as good as public opinion will allow them to be. And although Biden and Kamala have been more progressive on Israel-Palestine, at least in the last couple of administrations. Do you think the way that pro-Palestine voices in America are, do you think that makes it like easier or harder for people like Biden and Kamala to make concessions? Because I feel like now any move left on Israel-Palestine just inextricably links people like Kamala with the likes of like Jill Stein or the more far left voices who are just like the arms embargo camp, right? Okay. I guess we'll just have to see how that one goes. The West Bank's been very busy lately. Last month there was an attempted suicide bombing in Tel Aviv. It was a joint operation by the Al-Qassam and Al-Quds brigades, the military units of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, respectively. It was botched, so didn't kill anyone. Or I don't think it didn't kill any Israelis. It might have killed the attempted attackers. I can't remember. And seemed to be like there was some intention for them to try operations like that in the future. We know that Hamas and Islamic Jihad, when they're in the West Bank, they usually attack settlers. Like that's usually what they do. And there's a military presence there to deal with that. Them trying to go into Israel is a slightly newer thing. We haven't seen that too much recently. So in connection with that and in connection with just raised activity in general, Israel, at the end of last month, launched a raid into the West Bank, mainly focused around the refugee camps in Tulkarm and in Jenin, and I think just a couple of other places around the north of the West Bank. That lasted about 2 weeks. About 30 people died in total. 1 Israeli soldier died. Almost everyone who died was claimed by armed groups, mostly by Al-Qassam brigade, some by Al-Quds, and a couple by, I think even Al-Aqsa Martyrs were involved. They went through Jenin mainly. They went through Tulkarm, and there was a lot of property damage, and lots of people have lost access to water, electricity, all the rest of it. They have bulldozed about 70% of the roads in the Jenin area now, because they were supposedly digging up for. Apparently, I didn't even know this was a thing, but apparently people will hide IEDs in under the roads, so that if a vehicle is coming through, they can detonate it and blow it up. So there's been quite a bit of a mess over there right now. I think one person definitely seems to have died in circumstances that were not completely military. There was one 16-year-old girl who seems to have just pushed her head out the window when there was a gunfight in the house next to them, and got shot by a sniper. So by the IDF side. So the IDF side of the story is that there was they had made a warning to the 2 houses, one where there was a gunfight and the other one which was just next to it. They told both households to evacuate. And I think as the gunfight was happening in the first house, someone from the second house, this girl stuck her head out the window and got shot by the IDF. And it's obviously taken quite a massive toll on the civilian population in those areas in Jenin and Tulkarm. They also claim to have taken out quite a few famous or high-profile leaders of Islamic Jihad and Hamas. I think even on Hamas's page, they've said that they intend to retaliate with explosives and things like that. And I think they kind of allude a little bit to the suicide bombing attack as well when they say that. So I think that a lot of that has gone under the radar recently, is the increased tensions in the West Bank. Outside of that, around the same time, there was the Turkish-American girl who was killed. I don't know if you know about that, but it was a Turkish-American protester outside of the raids went to protest a settlement in the West Bank. And it's actually quite close to where we were. It was, remember Yitzhar, the settlement where the guy got sanctioned? Yeah. So if you go a little bit southeast of there are 2 Palestinian towns south of Nablus. And right in the middle, there's a road. And by that road, there's this settlement called, it's got a really weird name. I think it's Aviatar. I can not pronounce it, but there's a settlement there. And there's a really interesting history behind this particular area. So this is a really, really deep settlement, right? It's east of Ariel.
Okay.
You know, Ariel is, Ariel is the example of 2-state solution difficulties because of how deep it is. Even further east of Ariel, you've got places like Yitzhar, and then you've also got this one, Avitar. So it's very, very deep. On their own Facebook page, they kind of make 2 claims at once. One is they say that it's because they want to it's in response to Israelis being attacked on the intersection. So they want to set up a place where there's like a kind of sense of Israeli security for people who are driving through. And in other Facebook posts, they just talk about, reclaim this like holy area, Judea, Samaria, and also the idea of splitting up the two Palestinian villages that are on either side of it. So probably mixed reasons for people being there. But this particular place, it was an outpost, an attempted outpost in 2013, 2016, 2018, and 2021. It was always illegal under Israeli law, but in 2021, it was evacuated, but this time, nothing was bulldozed or demolished. So the fourth time they tried to settle it, it was evacuated, but they kept the structures in place. Then settlers spent the next 2 years protesting about this evacuation of this outpost, and just this year in June, it was authorized by the Security Cabinet. It was authorized along with 4 other outposts. So now it is like legally part of Israel according to the Israeli state. The reason they did that was because Smotrich said that he was, the idea was to authorize 1 outpost for every country that was recognizing Palestine.
Jeez. Okay.
So that month, 5 countries recognized Palestine. So the Security Cabinet authorized 5 outposts. All throughout this time, that settlement has been the site of protest. Like it's been had people going there rioting or sometimes peaceful protests. I think it's already been the site of 7 deaths of Palestinian residents from the town above it called Beta. Some were killed in connections with the protest, and some were like a little bit like separate in the sense of like there was like a feud between the settlers and the people in the other town, and then someone just gets killed on the road in between. So it's already been the site of a lot of protesting and and quite a bit of killing just in a short space of time. Just recently, a group of activists, one of whom was this Turkish-American girl, there was a protest. It turned violent. There were stones being thrown. There was like I think tear gas was attempted to be used on the other side. And at some point in that protest, the protester was shot, the Turkish-American girl.
By the IDF, right?
Yeah, she was shot by the IDF, right in the head. So the circumstances around her death are a little bit ambiguous, although so far it doesn't look too good. Like she was, the IDF said that she was in the area where there was violence. Like there was and they were responding to violence from protesters. The problem is that some footage has been released to the Washington Post, mostly by activists who had the footage, and some news reports have come out, and some local testimonies, statements have come out. It seems to be that when she got shot, the protests had actually peaked about half an hour earlier, and the people had retreated. So she was about 200 yards away when she was shot. And one of the protesters who was with her has said that once the violence broke out, like they were essentially trying to get away from it. Like they weren't there to be part of like throwing stones or anything. So we know that she didn't do anything herself. The IDF have said that. They said they were aiming for someone else. They were aiming for one of the instigators. There was a Palestinian teenager, like late teens guy, who was shot and wounded as well. But they wouldn't comment on whether or not he was the guy they were aiming for. So that's caused a bit of an issue with Turkey right now, because Turkey is like very, very adamant that this was like a targeted assassination of a local protest, like a foreign protester, and they're trying to like amp up the international pressure against Israel. I don't think the United States have actually responded all that much to it. I think Biden gave out a statement where he called it tragic, and then he like did a like statement against Hamas, and then that was it. It's interesting that while things are happening in Gaza, and every death of like someone in Gaza, it's really hard to tell because no one really has conclusive evidence over like, well, these people who died, were they militants or were they near infrastructure, or was it like a missed target, or was it like actually a targeting of civilians by a rogue soldier or a commander or whatever. But like in this case in the West Bank, like this is just because this right-wing government is recognizing settlements and allowing people to get away with setting up outposts like way in the heart of the West Bank and defending them with troops. And sometimes like even international people go there to protest against it and they get shot. So I mean, the way that, so what you said about outposts, like every outpost is illegal by Israeli law. The problem is that they're so adamant about making sure that it's basically impossible to remove them, because even whilst they're there might be like in this particular case, in this area, the problem is that the outpost sits on what is partially or mostly, I think, Area C, like Israeli, I think what they call it is survey land. But some of it seems to also be on top of Palestinian private property. Like it's right between Area A and B, I think, because it's very close to Nablus. So the problem is people will go there and there might be a legal issue about what the government wants to do about it and whether they want to get troops in. But in that time, they've already built up like modular homes or like different structures. Like in this particular outpost, even in 2021, the place already had like, it's got a playground, it's got a synagogue, it's got a study hall, it's got a grocery store. And it's they've already, unilaterally been able to like grab over bits of electrical wiring and stuff like that to hook themselves up to the supply. They've already started paving a road that connects it to the main Israeli roads in the Area C. And all it takes is like one angry Palestinian to come over there and attack someone, and then they need to have the soldiers there. And then even if they evacuate it, the structures are still there, and then the troops are there anyway because they're trying to defend the structures. Yeah. So like it's the way that they do that is just very, very, it's like they're very, very resourceful in how they manage to solidify their presence there. But and all it takes is like one or two like angry parties getting into the Knesset, and then they use it as punitive action to authorize as a response to international pressure. Thanks very much.
The current lieutenant governor of the great state of North Carolina is a guy by the name of Mark Robinson, and he is probably the craziest Republican in national politics. True, because there's always another one right around the... Yeah, no, 100%. So, like, I think he's crazier than Trump, Carrie Lake, Marjorie Taylor Greene. This guy is nuts. He's the current incumbent lieutenant governor. The Democratic governor of North Carolina is a guy by the name of Roy Cooper. He's term locked. He's done. Okay, so he's no longer able to seek re-election. So the gubernatorial race for North Carolina is between the current Attorney General, Josh, and the Lieutenant Governor. The CNN broke a devastating story about Mark Robinson and his, shall we say, eclectic history, his internet history, his pornography history. So he apparently was on a website, a message board, which I guess is the best purpose, the best services of a website. It's not for the images or the videos. You want to go for the rigorous debate. I mean, I imagine like that's the most comprehensive way to view porn, right? It's not, again, like really the plebs go there for the imagery, but like a real scholar of pornography, they go into the message. Fair enough. Listen, I'm learning as I go along, and let me tell you, this story from Mark Robinson will teach you quite a bit. So he called himself on this message board prior to him entering politics, but he was still well into adulthood. This is a guy in his 50s or 60s, so he was a critic and bigot of trans people, says he enjoys trans pornography, and they've been able, CNN, to trace him definitively, his identity to this message board. And he has denied the accusations. He says, of course it's not me. I have nothing to do with it. You all know my character. But many people are speculating that this will not only cost him the race, which he was already losing, Stephen, but it may cost Donald Trump North Carolina, which Republicans Democrats haven't won since 2008, President Obama. And as a consequence of losing ripple effects. He said not only is he basically the new Martin Luther King Jr., at various points Trump said, I think you're twice as good as Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, the shit that Trump would say about this guy is so like detailed that the vice president, she, of course, her campaign is rightfully making all kinds of hay with this. They're spamming a multi-million-dollar ad in North Carolina as we speak, emphasizing the close association between Trump and Robinson. I should also say at the time of recording, Donald Trump will be in North Carolina for a rally, and he has reportedly reached out to Mark Robinson, Martin Luther King Jr. 2.0, twice Martin Luther King Jr., the future of the Republican Party, and said, do not show up to that rally. You will not be appearing at that rally. So this is huge, buddy. No, yeah, 100%. Like, he wasn't trying to hide anything. I mean, Well, you know what's funny too, like the shamelessness of it. So reportedly before CNN broke the story, they reached out to Robinson's campaign and they gave him 48 hours. Like, hey, you want to comment on this? You want to weigh in? They declined. Then right before, the CNN reporting went live, they reached out and said, okay, we'll do an interview. And so Mark Robinson sat down for an interview virtually with CNN. I say virtually because he probably had another laptop up. he was probably like surfing on that particular message board during the interview. And of course, he lied. He just straight up lied. He said, of course, this isn't me. This is ridiculous. And what was interesting to me was the ease of the lie. Like, I've not been in this situation, but I have to imagine that even though I consider myself a confident person, I would just be scared shitless the whole time. But Mark Robinson looked the camera dead ass in the eye and lied very casually. He's like, my character, I would have nothing to do with anything like this. This is tabloid trash. These are my enemies trying to take me down. And the real question is, I wonder how many MAGA Republicans in North Carolina and across the country will buy that.
Folks here also know my character. They know.
Well, and I'll just say, kind of to wrap it up, I mean, apparently Republicans were really pushing behind the scenes for Robinson to actually just withdraw from the race, even though they had like 12 hours to get his name off the ballot. So they were basically willing to sacrifice the governor's mansion in North Carolina, knowing that they probably wouldn't be able to replace him, and just give it to the Democrats in order to get him out of the race, so it would put enough distance between him and Trump. Now, that ship sailed because he refused to drop out. So he's on the ballot. He is running for governor still. He was losing the election by like 8 to 10 points prior to the scandal. He will almost certainly lose the election as a consequence. But the real implication is, again, it's really risky for Trump, because if Trump loses North Carolina, which he was favored to win, even though it's a purple state, his chances of winning the presidency are significantly reduced. So fingers crossed. So because of Mark Robinson, even prior to the scandal, actually was considered to be in play. So again, it's one of those things. It's kind of like Wisconsin, where your community and Progressive Victory have gone out canvassing before. It is a de facto purple state in the sense that for every registered Republican, you do have a registered Democrat. But because Republicans have done such a good job of entrenching their power when they do have it, we haven't had a Democrat win North Carolina since 2008. And I should also say that that's in some small part because of the Democrats making decisions basically to gut their own infrastructure and move on to different states. But it was in play because Mark Robinson was so damn unpopular. And now it really is a coin flip. As of recent polling, Donald Trump was only winning in North Carolina in aggregate polling by 0.1 percentage points. That's how close it is. Yeah, he said he won't. He, in theory, he could withdraw even after this deadline. His name will still be on the ballot. In theory, he could just say, I'm suspending my campaign. I'm done. So I suppose I wouldn't put that off the table. But yeah, he's going to be on the ballot. And I would say, if I had to guess, I would say 90% likely he loses the governor's race to Attorney General Stein, which is good because then a Democrat will be in charge of North Carolina's executive branch. But I guess I really think this could cost Trump the election. We have two states in the United States which do not employ a winner-take-all system for their electoral college votes. One is Maine, precisely. So the situation is this. Republicans had been publicly flirting for months about changing their electoral system so that Omaha, which is basically that lone blue dot in Nebraska, if a Republican or whoever won the popular vote in Nebraska and won the majority of electoral votes, all of the votes would go to that person. And they threatened to do it months ago. They signaled that they would do it. Trump obviously wants them to do it. Republicans at the federal level want them to do it. In state, Nebraska, most of them, the Republican and the Republican governors, they want to change it. But this is the big but. Maine, on the other side of the country, said if you do that, we're going to switch our votes. We're going to cancel yours out by screwing over the Republicans in Maine to balance it out. And so for that and various other reasons, it basically cooled the threat. It's effectively the same thing. So they get it's one electoral vote for Maine for Republicans reliably. And so again, it's basically here's where the twist is. So Lindsey Graham, goes out to Nebraska and he meets with the Republican governor of Nebraska. And the Republican governor of Nebraska says, hey, listen, I will convene a special legislative session. I will call the Nebraska legislature back into session if a sufficient number, I think it was 33, if 33 Republicans will publicly support the measure to change how we vote here in North Carolina or Nebraska, Jesus. And as of this moment, they still are missing like 2 or 3 crucial endorsements, but the number is shrinking. And here's where the twist really is. In Maine, they've passed the deadline, Stephen, to change Maine's legislature. So in Maine, the difference is that you have to make changes to laws 90 days before an election. That's the deadline. Anything after that, you can't make any changes to how election laws are changed. So basically, the theory is that Republicans have ran out the clock, knowing that we're past the point for Maine to cancel out what they do. They would have to get a supermajority, which would involve Maine's Republicans voting in favor of it too. And Maine's Republicans say, if Nebraska changes how they vote, we're not going to do anything. We're not going to help the Democrats change how Maine votes in order to cancel it out. And the risk is, if Nebraska does this, if they do what Trump and Lindsey Graham are scheming to do, there's a plausible election outcome where the vice president wins Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, but loses the Sun Belt states. And as a consequence, Republicans win Nebraska, then it would make it 269 to 269. It goes to the House of Representatives, and guess who becomes president of the United States? Exactly. Precisely. It's called a state delegation. So yeah, I want to be very clear about it. It's important for Democrats to take back the House majority, especially when it comes to the certification of the ballot. You don't want a Speaker Mike Johnson presiding over the 2024 election certifications, given that Mike Johnson, as you know from your deep dives into Donald Trump's fake elector plot and January 6th stuff, Mike Johnson was a major ally to Trump's efforts to steal the presidency from President Biden. We do not want a Speaker Mike Johnson. But to your point, to be very clear, even if Democrats take back the House in November, and they're going to be gavelled in prior to the certification of the votes, that'd be good. But if it becomes a matter of state delegations, if this scheme works where they change Nebraska's law and the vice president doesn't win any of the Sun Belt states or North Carolina, and it becomes 269, yes, the Republicans will absolutely have the numbers advantage to make Donald Trump the president of the United States.
Well,
so I guess my question for you is, what do you think about that? I mean, because to me, it's kind of referencing a recent conversation you had with the potential Russian asset, Kim Iverson. I kid. It is a procedural loophole. But to me, it's as bad faith as anything we've seen from the Republicans, too. To me, it's just like a continuation of the lawfare to try to bend the rules to get Donald Trump to be elected president. What do you think? Yeah, it just seems pretty transparently bad faith. I mean, again, the fact that they've had years to do this if they wanted to, but it really seems like they're running out the clock to basically just preemptively disarm Maine from canceling them out. So, again, as of the moment, the initiative still lacks like 2 or 3 critical votes to support it, but it's entirely possible that could change. And I think that any gamble which relies on elected Republicans acting in good faith, that's a losing proposition in 2024, 100%. So the other big, major story is potential government shutdown, Stephen. That's where we are. So this has been a continuous threat since the Republicans took the majority in the House of Representatives back in January 2023. They negotiated a deal with President Biden in May of 2023 by holding the debt ceiling hostage, even though they helped run up America's credit card bills. They basically told the president, hey, listen, we're not going to help you raise the debt ceiling. We'll risk a national default and a global economic catastrophe unless you agree to budget concessions. So President Biden and then Speaker McCarthy worked out a deal. They made a deal. They shook hands. Biden held up his end. The Republicans, predictably, did not. It ultimately cost Kevin McCarthy his job, and we've been funding the government instead of a full budget through what's called a continuing resolution, which is basically a stopgap measure, which expires every 2 to 3 months. We're at the end of it again. The current continuing resolution under Mike Johnson expires on September 30th, so in 9 days. And on October 1st, if there's not a continuing resolution or a full budget, the government will shut down. And Donald Trump is publicly pushing for a government shutdown because he wants to make it harder for eligible Americans to vote. So it would increase the documentation threshold needed to prove citizenship and eligibility. And a sufficient number of, obviously no Democrats going to back it, and there are currently like internal schisms within the Republican Party about the budget that Republicans say they want. So they've basically been tripping over their own dick on this. They're not able to pass this stuff. And yeah, the consequence is that there may be a public government shutdown. And last thing I'll say is Mitch McConnell is not very happy about it. He was asked about it and said it would be beyond politically stupid for the Republicans to trigger a shutdown. And that's exactly what Trump is calling for. Yeah, so it is. It's one of the few times that the American electorate, I would argue, is rational. You and I aren't running for elected office, so we can call out our fellow Americans for being highly irrational and selective in terms of how they interpret information. But this is one of the few times that historically, when Republicans trigger shutdowns, and they're much more likely to than Democrats, they usually pay a price at the polls. In polling and also at the ballot box too. And that's the other thing. McConnell's like, we're weeks away from an election, and to trigger a government shutdown will almost certainly cost Republicans potentially all three. So, I mean, politically, it might be in Democrats' best interest for Republicans to give into their worst impulses. It'd be bad for the country, so I'm not encouraging it. But yeah, that's where they are, with Trump saying one thing, McConnell saying another, Mike Johnson being caught in the middle. But to your point, I don't know how you possibly thread that needle. Politically defying Trump and certainly doing it in public, it seems like a recipe for losing your job if you're a Republican. Yeah, I firmly believe that there's no real capacity for introspection in the Republican Party, because to your point, he won in 2016, but he lost the midterms in 2018. He lost the presidency in 2020. They lost the Senate runoffs in eminently winnable states. I mean, Georgia, right? And then they lost the 2022 midterms and then the 2023 off-year elections. And there's just no limiting principle. If anything, the base that's loyal to Trump is even more loyal now than ever. I think as long as he's alive and as long as he wants to maintain some sort of active role in politics, he has them. He has them by the short and curlies, and that's it. Like, he either retires from politics and says, I'm going back to reality TV or just to golf, then they can be free, or that's it. I think even in defeat, he is still their God King. No, 100%. Then last thing I'll say is the Supreme Court. I know you are aware of this, but it's a pet issue for both of us. There was a New York Times op-ed which interviewed dozens of court officials and people affiliated with the court. Obviously, they were granted anonymity in order to speak, but basically going into the departure of Chief Justice John Roberts from being like this moderating, mediating voice, always trying to gather either unanimity or a supermajority, basically trying to court liberals in order to grant their rulings more legitimacy. And it seems that in the most recent Trump-related cases, Chief Justice Roberts has been engaging with more open partisanship than his reputation would suggest on both the Trump immunity case as well as some of the other Trump-related cases. And I know you are aware of the story, so I'm curious what your thoughts are, because I have not heard you get a chance to really react to it at length. You'll note that one of the cases, now I'm blanking on it, you might have to correct me, but one of the cases, according to that article, was supposed to be written by Justice Alito. And then 2 or 3 days after that flag story broke, Chief Justice Roberts took that case away from Alito so that Roberts could write the opinion. Here's my question. If it could be proven or reasonably inferred that the reason he did that was because he was aware that that story would be politically damaging to the court, would that not reinforce what you and I have been calling for, that Alito should have recused himself? Like, basically, if Roberts recognized that that is politically damaging to the appearance of the court, by definition, wouldn't that mean that Alito should have recused himself? Or it seems to me, I mean, obviously they can't prove it definitively, but the timeline is such, but I can't speak for you. All I can say is that I don't give the court the benefit of the doubt anymore. So when timelines start to add up in ways that kind of lead to a cynical interpretation, that's just kind of what I default to anyway. But the last thing I'll say on the court is Donald Trump recently said that if he becomes president again, he would look to appoint 2, and he was very specific, a couple of MAGA justices, seeming to me to suggest that he knows that Thomas and Alito will retire if he becomes president again. I mean, my God, she would be, she's what, in her early 40s? There's no age requirement. Unlike the presidency, you don't have to be 35 years old to be a Supreme Court justice. What is to stop him from not only creating not just a right-wing majority, but a MAGA majority? And the 2 people that he could put in Thomas and Alito's place could be young ideologues like Judge Cannon as a reward for her hard work.
Truly horrifying.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So that's it in the world of politics. That's basically all the news is, again, nowhere near as salacious and as sexy in terms of assassination attempts and all these things. It's not like high-profile drama, but it is enough going on procedurally that I think that there could be major influence on the outcome of the election. No, 100%. And you know what's interesting is to see like right-wing commentators, pundits, and influencers try to parse that out in a way which is, again, pretty generous to Vance. Well, he's not saying that he lied. He's just saying that, you know, he took these unsubstantiated rumors and used them to draw national attention to an ongoing issue that he can't exactly identify. Like, he didn't say he lied. He said he used things to create a story. And it's just like, I don't, number one, of course, my litmus test is what if a Democrat said that? How would, not only are they unsubstantiated, they are directly contradicted by the mayor of Springfield, the sheriff or the chief law enforcement officer of Springfield, and also Governor DeWine, a Republican. I mean, like, it's directly, there's no evidence to support it, and it's directly contradicted by people who are otherwise politically aligned with Donald Trump and Republicans. And it's so wildly irresponsible to say nothing of the fact that the Haitian community there, they're not undocumented. They're not illegal. They're here legally. Like, the whole thing is, it's insane. And it goes back to something we talked about in that first episode, which is we have to find a way to enforce standards, whatever the standard is. So like, I agree that there should be stricter standards for both parties just overall. But even if your standard is let politicians say whatever the hell they want, I think that's insane, but at least apply it across the board. Mm-hmm. What happens is again and again and again, these MAGA Republican politicians are just graded very nakedly on a curve. And that's just not sustainable because there's no incentive for MAGA to normalize. Why on earth would they? They don't get punished for it. I mean, you could say that they suffer electoral defeats, but to your point, this is still a close election, even with all the shit going on. This election is still, for the most part, within the margin of error. No, for real. I mean, like, my God, if not for your policy positions, they'd love you, Stephen, for the controversy and the scandals. Unfortunately, the policies are much too rational, I think, for the modern Republican Party, which really doesn't traffic in any of the other problem is, of course, if somebody asked you, hey, Stephen, what would you do to lower the cost of childcare? You could actually give an answer, unlike Donald Trump. So I don't know, man. This is crazy. There's no telling what's going to happen like next week. But yeah, right now the Republicans are really working overtime to procedurally change the outcome of elections. We didn't even get a chance to talk about what's going on in Georgia. That there's an ongoing story there with them changing how votes are tallied in ways that Brad Raffensperger, the Republican Secretary of State, and other Republican officials are like, this is insane. All it's going to do is create chaos during Election Day. But Trump supporters on the board of elections in Georgia passed a new rule, basically demanding that votes be counted manually in every precinct on Election Day. Which, of course, as you know, is much more likely to be prone to errors and contradictions than machine voting. And many people fear, including Raffensperger and other statewide Republicans, that this will create an atmosphere for Donald Trump and MAGA to challenge the results of the election or to challenge certification, to delay certification by basically creating a problem in advance. No, like I said, another potential government shutdown. And then I think it's the week after we have the vice presidential debate between Governor Tim Walz and J.D. Vance. I appreciate it, buddy.
This week, we're going to start with the criminal complaint of the attempted assassin of Donald Trump. There were a lot of confusion on Twitter and in the internet about exactly what this is, and so I wanted to break that down a little bit. So first, people were a little bit shocked that he was only charged with 2 counts, possession of, and the initial reaction to this was, what gives? You know, this is the attempted assassin of Donald Trump. And so the first takeaway that some people were getting from that is, oh, then this guy wasn't really attempting to kill the former president of the United States. But that's not right. I'm sure you saw some of that going around, right? One from Blue MAGA, which I consider to be the kind of, you might say, assumption-taking left, and the other from actual Red MAGA, who take the sort of conspiracy route. So let's start with the one that you took. One route that people were taking and interpreting from the Red MAGA was, this shows the corrupt bringing charges to people is probable cause. But as a matter of policy and as a matter of just the practicalities of running a prosecution, you don't really want to bring an indictment until you have proof beyond a reasonable doubt that someone is guilty of an offense. Sure, yeah. So the American system doesn't put exact percentages on it, but people have kind of estimated it due to case law. So for example, probable cause is like the normal standard for arrests, for getting warrants, and people put that roughly in the 33% chance. And why is that actually? Because we have there was a case, I actually forget the name of it, but essentially there were a choice of 3 doors, and one of, the bad guy had gone under one of them. There was an exception to the warrant requirement, and he opened one that it wasn't actually the bad guy, but the question was, did he have probable cause to open one of those doors? The answer was yes. And so you can sort of gather, Stephen, you get a rough approximation for that, which you mentioned is different than probable cause. That's a burden of proof usually to stop and investigate. It's called stop and frisk. So that might be to pull you over. It's what's known as a Terry stop. And that is some standard. It's less than probable cause. You might say a cop sees you speeding, right? You have probably probable cause to pull you over. But if you have like a crime scene, maybe you have reasonable suspicion that anyone in the area could be involved or could have some evidence related to that. Not exact percentage, but something less than maybe in the 33% range. Beyond a reasonable doubt, that is the standard that people are very familiar with to convict someone of a crime in court. And that is like, take it to the 99%, right? Some super high threshold where there's no reasonable doubt that this person is guilty of the offense. You with me so far, Steve?
Yep.
Okay. And to sort of put out what this guy could be accused of, suppose that we were going to take a murder statute to apply or homicide statute to apply to this guy. He didn't actually kill anyone, right? So we can't charge him with the substantive offense of murder because the substantive elements of murder are to cause the death of another human being with malice aforethought. But of course, no one's dead. And so what can you charge him with? That's the realm of attempt liability. And attempt liability, and I guess we're going to start with Blue MAGA, actually, I lied to you, isn't, with respect to an assassin, did he take a shot? Did he have this, the victim in sight? What you're hearing from a lot of left-wing commentators are the fact that the evidence seems to indicate that the shooter never fired a bullet or never had Trump in his scopes means this wasn't actually an attempt. Under the law, that's not what's required. What's required is the intent to commit that substantive offense. So in this case, the intent to cause the death of another human being, which we'll talk about the evidence for that so far. I think it's pretty clear that that was what he wanted to do, unless you have any disagreements. Right, and so you need that intent, and you need a substantial step. And a substantial step is not some threshold where we know you're going to be successful, as Stephen mentioned. It's basically showing that you have acted with the kind of culpability that would be required to commit the offense. And one of the classic examples of a substantial step is lying in wait. And this guy was literally, according to sources, lying in wait for like hours and hours on end with a potential step. But let's get back to the charging decision. Well, then why not charge him, right? Well, actually, right, you're going to eventually have to prove this case in court. And you're going to want to have evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that this guy actually intended to kill Donald Trump. If you just go and, guns blazing and just said, well, obviously it's true, you maybe won't have as strong of a case if you have, for instance, a bunch of evidence from his phones or from third parties that might illuminate his state of mind at the time. Once you charge, it can complicate getting more evidence when you use a grand jury to charge, because you're really not supposed to use a grand jury once you indict to investigate the very thing that someone's been indicted for. So it's a little bit more complicated, and it can lead to some troubles gathering evidence. You really want to wait until you have all the evidence before you charge. Well, then why did you get gun charges? That's to hold him, right? You want to charge him with something. So charge him with the thing that, okay, it's super easy to prove. This is a gun. Its serial was defaced. He was in possession of it. He's a previous felon in possession of a gun. Charge him, hold him. And so I hope that clears things up for people about why they would charge the lesser offenses, and why it doesn't mean that he didn't criminally attempt to kill the president. Doesn't mean that more charges aren't going to be coming. And it doesn't mean necessarily that the DOJ is diligent and they're taking their time before they charge to gather the evidence. I haven't done a survey on, like a 50-state survey on what the relative percentages are of different jurisdictions applying those rules. But yeah, you could imagine that there could be some difficulties in like bringing your case to bear, even just for the jury, right? The jury maybe is less willing to split the baby, even if it were legally, technically okay, procedurally okay to bring these kind of lesser included offenses, if you don't have all the evidence and you don't have all your ducks in a row. You don't want to mess up this case. It's kind of like the Alec Baldwin situation, if you recall. Now you can have your own opinions about whether he was guilty or not, but there was a Brady violation and prosecutorial misconduct which scuttled that case, along with other kind of issues that weren't the basis of the dismissal, but the prosecutorial misconduct really jeopardized that case and even the case they've already convicted on. And so it's very important for our system that prosecutors who hold enormous power take their time, get the evidence before charging, and everyone who is spreading misinformation, either from the left or the right, about why the charges were the way they were, are doing a disservice to our institutions and to our system of government. I totally agree with that. On the arraignment point, different states might have different rules on the books. There's a constitutional minimum. I think it might be 48 hours, but as a matter of practice, sometimes that's not met. But for these kinds of cases, important to make sure that we're dotting our I's and crossing our T's. And so appreciate that, Stephen, and totally agree. Speaking about, though, potential government corruption, there's a clear and present danger to the voting system and the voters in North Carolina. Did you know that, Stephen? Watched or read CNN's wonderful report on that matter. You should. He's a self-avowed black Nazi pervert who, even though he's against LGBTQ rights, enjoys transgender porn, likes Hitler, but that's all in CNN's reporting. I would agree, he's a clear and present danger in some sense, but he's losing in the polls. And so I actually think that there's another danger in North. Shouldn't be electing people who say one thing but mean another, or who say, for example, that abortion is murder, but then have abortions like Mark Robinson did as well. Honestly, I think that the voters should have a say in that. And I think that they're having their rights curtailed. And they're having their rights curtailed by a person. And that person's name is Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Uh-oh.
In North Carolina, there is a statutory obligation, a right that North Carolinians have to vote 60 days before an election. That's a right in law. Brings us to RFK Jr. A few weeks back, maybe a month or so back, RFK Jr., before trying to sell his services like a mercenary, announces that he is suspending his campaign, not terminating the campaign. Very clear, not terminating. And he announces some states where he wants to be off the ballot. Doesn't include North Carolina in the list of states. Well, because he's playing a game. This guy, RFK Jr., is playing a game. He's trying, on his own whims, to step away in states where he thinks he could negatively affect Trump, stay on in states where he thinks it might benefit Trump or benefit himself in some way. And there's a little bit of a cute wink, wink, nudge, nudge. This is what I'm doing. And in the course of doing so, he is depriving North Carolinians, or did deprive North Carolinians, of their right to vote. And I'll explain how. He did not mention North Carolina in his termination speech. North Carolina has rules for when it is you are supposed to get your name off of a ballot if you're a candidate. Can you think of some policy rationales for why it might make sense for a state to have a cutoff date for when you want to withdraw from the ballot? Yeah, they have to print the ballots, right? They happen, right? North Carolina has a cutoff date for when you're supposed to withdraw your name from the ballot. That's also a matter of law. It's black letter law. It's clear as day. And North Carolina printed millions of ballots, and actually thousands of different kinds of ballots, because you imagine you're going to different places within the state of North Carolina. There can be different seats for different places. So thousands of different types of ballots, millions of ballots. A couple days after the state's cutoff period for when you're supposed to withdraw from the election, Robert F. Kennedy is asking to be taken off the ballot, even though the cutoff date has passed. The ballots have been printed. Voting is supposed to start within days. And he wants to have them all destroy the ballots that exist and print new ones, millions of ballots. The necessary effect of that is voting will be delayed. Voting will be delayed because, as I told you, there's a 60-day right to vote in the state of North Carolina. And that's exactly what the North Carolina Supreme Court allowed. In a 4-3 decision, decided that the whims of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. should override the people's right to vote in North Carolina. We are now 2 weeks from when that occurred, and finally, yesterday, ballots were sent to the people. You want to talk about the litigation against RFK Jr., how it's so unfair. RFK Jr. Shouldn't have been sued in New York when he lied about his residency, or RFK Jr., it was wrong for us to have any rules for him to be on the ballot. I think it's wrong for RFK Jr. on his own whims, in a bad faith manner, getting off the ballot in some states, getting on in other states, to deprive North Carolinians of their right to vote. Reasons why the news of Robinson is relevant now is Friday was the day where you're supposed to, or maybe the day before, was the day that you were supposed to, the final day for you to decide whether or not you want to be your candidate, your party's candidate. And so there was a question about whether Ken Robinson even withdraw after this revelation came out, unless he does so in this particular window. And so officially, it's over. So he's going to be the candidate. And when you put your mark on Robinson, it's going to go to him and not any other candidate the Republicans might want to nominate. But does anyone now have the confidence that if this were to go to the North Carolina Supreme Court, despite the black letter law of what the rules say, that they would follow it? And I think that some things that these rulings do is they undermine the faith that the people have that the rules are as written. And one of the reasons we were supposed to prefer textualist judges is the kind of predictive nature of their rulings. But it seems that sometimes certain politicians are going to be favored over others. And that's exactly what I believe is happening in North Carolina. Do you know who Puff Daddy is, Destiny? Sure. So Puff Daddy, aka P. Diddy, aka Sean Combs, aka Diddy, aka PD, aka Love, and a part of the hip hop community, a mogul, some might say, a producer, and has obviously been in the game for decades. He was affiliated with Biggie Smalls and other kind of rap peoples, who have relied on him for their careers and has had a big influence on hip hop and rap in general. He was indicted over certain things that he and his associates, let's say, have done. And I thought it was a good opportunity for us to briefly discuss RICO, because you often will hear conversations about RICO and this reference to RICO, and it's actually very mystifying for certain people. And I thought it might be helpful to briefly go over what RICO is about, and then you guys can take it, what you've just learned, and apply it to the what you just, if you want to read the indictment of Sean Combs, aka P. Diddy. Yeah, sure. So in the 70s, Congress passed the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization Act. I think it's called, I forget exactly the name of the statute, but it brought a new form of charge at that time to deal with organized crime, particularly, but not exclusively, the mob. These were situations in which, like you mentioned, there's a lot of crime going on here, and the nature of the offense relates to the underlying crime, yes, but also the organizational aspect to it. And what RICO did was give an avenue for prosecutors to, kind of tar all members of a criminal organization with the underlying acts of each other, and also a way to go up the chain a little bit. And so it really kind of helped prosecutors, some might say too much, with harsh penalties for organized crime. That was kind of the purpose of it. There's a lot of confusion about RICO because people seem to have this assumption that you need to do the underlying acts in order to be charged with them. That's not always the case. So I'm going to go through now the RICO elements and speak a little bit about them. And then you can use what you've learned, and hopefully it'll apply to, or the indictment that you read of P. Diddy will make more sense. And so RICO, there's 4 kind of substantive offenses under RICO, and what I'm about to say will include all of them. It applies to any person, and person here, again, you have to read the definition of person because it might be more broad than you think, who, two. This is number two now. So those are the kind of the what. So if you are investing in something, right, acquiring an interest in something, conducting or participating in the affairs of something, or conspiring, remember a conspiracy is like an underlying meeting of the minds in agreement, conspiring to do any of those three things, in an enterprise, that's the organization, right? In the context, if you guys saw the Georgia RICO statutes, that enterprise was like the Trump election enterprise, right? And you can look into the definition of enterprise and how broad and narrow it is and what the contours of it is, but you essentially need some kind of association there. So again, if a person invests in, acquires an interest in, or participates in, or conspires to do those things of an enterprise, that enterprise engages in interstate commerce or foreign commerce, or their activities affect interstate or foreign commerce, that fourth element that I'm going over right now is a jurisdictional hook so that Congress can regulate it. Congress is a government of limited powers. And so you'll often see little things like affecting interstate commerce or utilizing the instrumentalities of interstate commerce or the channels of interstate commerce. That's a way to signal, hey, Supreme Court, we're just limiting our regulation to things over which we have jurisdiction. And so that's the fourth element. And finally, the fifth element, probably the most important to people's minds, a pattern of offenses, of predicate acts, at least two. So get that in your head. It's about people's participation in, investment towards an enterprise which affects interstate commerce in some way, and that enterprise participates in a pattern of criminal activity, at minimum 2 predicate acts. I'm glossing over a lot of nuance in that description, but the reason I'm giving it to you is that you have a better understanding of what's going on here. So when we expect to see in the indictment of P. Diddy, either conspiracy, RICO, investment RICO, right? Acquiring RICO, conducting RICO. And we actually do see in the indictment a conspiracy. Conspiracies are often easier to prove. You just need to prove that there was an agreement. And you're going to see they're going to have to specify what the enterprise is, and they're going to have to specify the predicate acts. And so you'll see, in if you read the indictment now, all the different predicate offenses in terms of, bringing in foreign prostitutes, different financial crimes, different assaults, that kind of thing. And as you read them, understand they're not charging those underlying crimes. They're part of the predicate acts, which are the underlying of the RICO charge. And so that's what he was charged with. There are other charges as well, but I hope that helped a little bit. Stephen, if you have any questions real quick before we sign off, I'll be happy to hear them. That's right. And so thank you so much, Stephen, and the audience for indulging me. I really appreciate the opportunity to teach you guys some things. And if you have any questions, please put them in the comments.
But a lot of news between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. I think we'll start with a historical anecdote. Throughout the Israel-Palestine conflict, in the Arab and Muslim world, there's always been a particular leader or organization that takes up the mantle of being the spearhead against Zionism. So right now, that is obviously Iran and the Axis of Resistance. Once upon a time, it was Nasser in Egypt. For a period, it was also Saddam Hussein, especially late 80s, early 90s. Saddam Hussein at one point built up a lot of clout in the Middle East by posing as the guy who was going to take on Israel. He would go on, a lot of it was just rhetorical. He would support Palestinian armed groups, but a lot of it was just rambling about how he was going to scorch half of Israel with chemical weapons and things like that. I think in the first Gulf War, he fired Scuds over at Israel. So in the early 90s, after the first Gulf War, Israel actually had a plan to assassinate him. And they went through a whole bunch of different schemes for how they would try to achieve this. One involved booby-trapping a statue that Saddam Hussein would visit once a year for a memorial service, and they would just blow it up as he bowed his head towards the monument. One of the plans involved starting up a shell company, attempts that failed and ended up killing 6 IDF soldiers. Interestingly, that is slightly relevant to what they did just recently. So a couple of days ago, at 3:30 in the afternoon, about 4,000 pagers exploded almost in immediate succession across Lebanon, mostly in Beirut, but also some in the south and some in the Bekaa, basically areas where Hezbollah is strongly concentrated. A number of people were killed. I think about 12. Is that this pager shipment was purchased by Hezbollah. It was purchased by them and distributed amongst, they say, set to explode at a particular either, which is very typical. I think it's very easy to assume that they did it. The deaths seem to so far mostly have been claimed by Hezbollah's armed forces. They have their website where they publish everyone who died. Out of the 12 were claimed by Hezbollah. 4 of them seem to have also been healthcare workers. I don't know if they were medics exclusively or if they were multitasking. It's given how Hezbollah operates, it could be either. Very tragically, 2 of the people who died were children. One of them was a 10-year-old who actually was in the kitchen when the pager went off. It beeped for about 10 seconds. She picked it up to go and bring it to her. That's day 1. Day 2, a bunch of Hezbollah walkie-talkies explode, killing another 25 people roughly, and injuring another few hundred. So that's twice now. And then the next couple of days has just been recently, is when Israel has just been bombing building. There were some of Hezbollah's highest ranked commanders. One of the guys whose name is Ibrahim, bombings in the 80s, one of which killed about 60 people in the US embassy, another one which killed about 250 US Marines in a barracks. So he's a very high profile figure. He's one of the, I think, highest or second highest ranking people in what's called the Radwan, which is Hezbollah's elite militant force. These are about 9,000 or 10,000 fighters who are probably some of the most experienced fighters in the Middle East. They've been fighting for about 10 plus years in Syria. They're very well trained. They're very well equipped because of their land connections through Iraq and Syria to Iran. And in that strike, about 30 people died, and so far 16 of them were claimed by Hezbollah, including that person. Hezbollah have been firing rockets at Israel since October 8th. Last couple of days has been an escalation in quite a few ways. One, Israel has not ever hit 3,000 people at once in Lebanon. Like, that's not been a thing. I think so far they've killed about 300 Hezbollah fighters, about 90 civilians. Most of the fighting's been at the border in very, very clear scenarios. There's also been kind of an unwritten rule that they haven't gone into dense civilian areas like Dahia in Lebanon and Beirut, but this time obviously they did because these guys were underneath one of the civilian buildings. So things have really, really kicked off in the last few days.
I think, yeah.
So to that last question, definitely not. We know from 2 IRGC guards, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps people, who were interviewed by the New York Times. They were quite clear that these particular pagers and walkie-talkies were only distributed amongst Hezbollah members. Now, not all Hezbollah members are actually soldiers. Some of them are civilians, although there's always a bit of a blurry line between those two because so many Hezbollah fighters are secretly fighters, even to the Lebanese people. So they might be fighting, but they might also have civilian jobs. But they were for Hezbollah, we know that. We know as well that they were actually circulated amongst Hezbollah people only a few hours before they went off. It was very, very recently they had them in their hands. There's one video where a pager blows up in someone's dresser. That's a harder question, but we do know as well that the reason Hezbollah had this technology, seemingly very old and primitive technology compared to what we have now, is in February, there's a broadcast that Nasrallah gave, and he devotes quite a few minutes out of a 1-hour speech warning Hezbollah people. He says specifically fighters. He stresses about how every phone is a spy. Like, they don't need spies. The spy is your phone. They know everything about you because of what's on your phone. He urges Hezbollah people, especially militants in the south, to lock their phones away in metal boxes. In that case, the problem was actually Israeli hubris. I don't think the technology Hezbollah had to do that was massively sophisticated, but it was sophisticated enough that the IDF were not used to it because they were used to fighting small disconnected cells in West Bank and Gaza at that time. So yeah, they were very surprised by that. And the commanders actually did tell people not to communicate by radio, but they did anyway. So because they just thought these guys aren't going to have the capabilities to do that. Well, in July, only a few months ago, there was an article actually out by Reuters that was talking about Hezbollah and how they had switched over to things like landlines, sometimes even couriers to deliver messages, and also pagers. That this was something that they were actually kind of proud of at the time, was that they had switched back to this technology, which would be harder for Israel to intercept. So, of course, they did intercept it, but they intercepted it seemingly by either making these devices themselves or by intercepting them at some point in the chain. The pagers were attributed to a Taiwanese company, first of all, but then it seems that by a very strange, shadowy company that we don't have that much details on, that's actually based in Budapest. The company's address is actually based at a civilian house in Hungary. And as far as we know, that company doesn't typically make pagers, but they were somehow able to get 5,000 pagers together, potentially arm them, and get them to Hezbollah. So whether or not they have informants or collaborators inside Hezbollah who knew to go for that company, or if they just knew exactly how to set up this company in a way that Hezbollah would find it and buy things from it, that's all very mysterious. But it does answer a few questions about legality, because the question about booby traps, and this would bring you to additional protocol 2 of the Convention on Conventional Weapons. So that convention,
that's not Geneva. You're right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So that convention does, and Israel is signed up to it, so they have to follow it.
Okay.
Yeah, they are signed up to it, and it does have a paragraph. I think it's Article 7, Section 2, that does say you can't use otherwise harmless-looking objects as booby traps. But they make an exemption in Section 3, which says that you can do it, especially in an area that might have civilians in it, either if it's in close proximity or on a military objective, or you give warning. They didn't give warning, but it seems to be that they had good enough reason to believe that most of these pagers would be close to or on a military objective, i.e. Hezbollah fighters. Now, I don't know if Israel considers every member of Hezbollah a target, or if it's just the militants, or if they believe that a majority of these pagers went to militants and the civilian members were collateral damage. But that's where the big contention comes, is actually how much they knew before they actually carried out the strike about roughly, like, I think the standard is a reasonable expectation. So whether or not they had a reasonable expectation that this would mostly hurt militants, and also that they would gain the military advantage, which is to shatter the communication abilities of their enemy, which they've definitely achieved the latter. Hezbollah are in shambles. Nasrallah gave a speech following the attack, and he's very much admitted that this is like a very, very, very damaging attack to them. Yeah. He did a bit of damage control, saying that higher members were not using the same network of pagers, so they're fine. But
on the thing real quick, you said, or finish his speech, go ahead.
But he is also quite clear that this has put them in a bit of a difficult situation. He normally broadcasts live when he does his broadcast. He never really appears in public because he's too vulnerable, I guess. But it doesn't seem like this broadcast was live either. So he is definitely a bit worried, and it seems like they all are. So
I was going to say
that part's definitely been crossed, but how much they knew about proportionality, I'm not too sure yet. Hassan Nasrallah said 4,000. So 4,000 explosions and about 3,000 injuries. The Lebanese government has been spending the last few days going up and down the country trying to check for any other pieces of equipment that might have been lying around, which is obviously a problem as well. I think when it comes to assessing proportionality, you'd have to account for that too. When it comes to, so there's not really any controversy about whether or not the pagers were for Hezbollah. Like they were. I think you could probably ask a question about civilian Hezbollah members being on the same network or being given the same shipment of pagers as people who are militants. There might be a question mark about why they would do that. I don't know why they think a Hezbollah, like a clerk or a tax collector or something like that, would need to have a pager the same that a militant does, but it's not impossible, especially since medical people who work for Hezbollah. Yeah, and it definitely doesn't help that groups like Hamas and Hezbollah don't necessarily always tell you that. So they will have their brigades, their Al-Qassam brigades or the Radwan or the Al-Quds brigades. That's usually a good enough rule of thumb, but not always, because right now Hezbollah have claimed, I think, 32 or 37 out of the 37 or 40 who died. There are a couple of mixed figures, but they've claimed most of the people who died in the last few days from those 2 days of the explosions. The problem is there were also Israeli airstrikes in the south, although Israeli airstrikes in the south at that time don't usually kill that many people. So it seems very likely that most of the people who died were killed by the pagers, and most of the people who died were claimed by the armed forces, not by civilian members, but they're listed as mujahid, not just martyr, but mujahid, which means fighter. And obviously on their obituary and their picture, they're in military uniform, whether they're photoshopped or not, but yeah, they are. So I think that bit is clear enough. As for the injuries, well, the pagers, you can see videos of a pager exploding on someone in a fruit market. And there are 3 people who are literally a foot away from him in this crowded area, and all 3 of them are fine. 2 of them run away, and the other guy just kind of stands around scratching his head, wondering what happened. So the pagers seemed like the explosions were small enough that even in a civilian area, it wouldn't cause that much harm around them. I don't know if the same is true for walkie-talkies, because the walkie-talkies were larger. I think one of them set a car on fire, and one of them did seem to go off like right in the middle of a funeral. So there's probably a bigger question mark around that one. It seems like the number of killed people for the walkie-talkies, as well as the number of people claimed on Hezbollah's website, is the same. There's 25 people. But the injuries are probably, I would be very surprised if a lot of those injuries were not civilians. All that also matters in terms of what you're planning to achieve next, because if Israel had just done this to mog Hezbollah and make them look stupid, that's not really a military advantage. If they'd done it to break down their communications for further strikes, that might make more sense, because right now they've targeted a bunch of rocket launch sites and also some very, very high profile Radwan figures. Whether or not this means they're trying to build up for a ground invasion, I think that would probably be very unjustified and very unwise, because I don't really know, given what's happened in Gaza, if a ground invasion of Lebanon, where Hezbollah is much stronger, is going to help anyone. But if they're doing it because they're just a bit fed up of rockets getting fired over northern Israel and displacing tens of thousands of people, and they just want that to stop and put them on the back foot, then that might make more sense. It seems so far to be the latter, but
do we have a response from the Lebanese government? Do we know how they feel about everything that's happened, or?
Well, Hezbollah is in large part the Lebanese government. They have a lot of members in the Lebanese government. So they've generally just said this is a war crime. This is like there will be reprisals, or this has caused a lot of civilian loss and like terrorize the population. They are a bit different in the sense that there is some dispute between Lebanese officials and Hezbollah themselves. So there's not really, people haven't really tried to claim that, for example, the pages and walkie-talkies were just held by random people. That claim is probably out the window, because no one seems to be making it. I don't know about, as far as what goes forward, that's a little bit of a harder question. I don't really know what happens next. There's not really any indication from the Israeli government yet what they want to do. Again, it feels like they've achieved everything they can militarily. They've said that that the Hamas brigades in Khan Yunis are just gone. They're completely wiped out. That's what they've said. But again, the problem with Gaza is not going to be so much Hamas brigades. It's going to be Hamas insurgents. That part's not going away for a very long time. We know that Netanyahu does not want to let go of the Philadelphia corridor because of the tunnels that were found there, and the tunnels that we actually already knew were there into Egypt. As far as military action, I don't think they're going to do anything like they did in the north anytime soon. I think that part is kind of past. I think right now all they're going to do militarily is going to be effectively playing whack-a-mole with Hamas insurgents until they try to figure out what the government wants, whether or not Netanyahu is going to hold power, whether or not people like Yoav Gallant are going to stay in government, whether or not Benny Gantz is going to launch a kind of counter claim for government or for a different plan. But you know what Netanyahu is like, right? He's a status quo politician. So the status quo now is Israel just hangs around Gaza and hits Hamas when they pop up from the ground, and then that's it, right? And that could last for decades.
Sure.
That there might be no end in sight for that. I think the only thing that's going to help Gaza from now is if someone, preferably, I'd imagine not Israel, but some kind of international effort is there to try and rebuild the place and set up a form of government that is neither Hamas nor another Israeli Area C business. Yeah, and the problem is as well, we mentioned Lebanon. If you remember very early on in the war, just after October 7th, America sent aircraft carriers into the Mediterranean as a way to tell Hezbollah that if they escalate and try to do a similar thing in northern Israel, then then America's going to get involved. Well, Hezbollah and Israel have basically had a few unwritten rules where most of the fighting takes place at the border. That's why you haven't seen the same civilian loss of life in Lebanon that you have seen in Gaza. Most of the people who have died before these pager explosions, definitely, probably even now, have been Hezbollah fighters, like 3-1 almost. So that is that's been the status quo, but now a few boundaries have been shifted with the pager attacks and also with them launching strikes on Dahia, which is a densely populated area. It's a neighborhood in Beirut. So if Israel gets involved further than what they've already done now, then what's that going to mean for America, right? Like, I know Nasrallah has been very vague in saying there's going to be reprisals, there's going to be retribution. It might not come anytime soon, but what if they do something that actually does pull Israel into Lebanon? Well, America said that if that happens, then they get involved. And then if America gets involved, what does Iran do? And then what happens in Syria? Because a lot of people don't know this. Hezbollah and Bashar al-Assad in Syria are good friends. They help each other. Hezbollah has been instrumental almost since 2012 in helping Assad maintain control in Syria. That's why the Radwan forces are so experienced. They've helped Assad take part in sieges. They've helped him clear out villages. They've conducted quite a few what seem to be massacres of civilian populations. They've been very instrumental in that. So things that affect Hezbollah affect Syria as well. A few of those pager explosions took place in Syria. People in Damascus were hit. So that's the real fear, is that I don't think there could be a potential answer to Hamas in Gaza, like now that the Strip is more or less controlled by Israel from top to bottom. That's never going to be the case for Lebanon. That's not going to be how it happens. So that's why everything there raises a lot of questions. And it also raises a lot of questions if a war kicks off in Lebanon. That's going to be even more of a deterrent from the international community to try to get involved in Gaza or anything Israeli related. Because the amount of destruction that would happen in a war with Hezbollah in Lebanon would be another thing that just puts most of the world against getting involved in that issue.
Yeah, I don't know.
It could, because I think, and I don't know how for sure about this, I've only heard this anecdotally and just from watching a few interviews in the news. The problem with that pager attack especially, and the fact that Israel has not gone in for a full ground invasion, is that humiliation is an important part of war, right? Like in terms of just like how it can affect the enemy's psyche, but also in Hezbollah's case, how it affects how the locals view them as well.
Yeah.
Because there were parts of Lebanon, mostly Maronites, but also Syrians as well, Syrian refugees, who were very happy to see what happened to Hezbollah, because to them, these guys are tyrants. They are people who have seized over parts of Lebanon. They've been brutal to the Syrians, and that they're actually part of the reason Syrians fled into Lebanon, because of Assad's actions. So that is not great when it comes to Hezbollah's popularity. The reason Hezbollah manages to maintain popularity quite a lot is not just because of their ability to provide welfare and improve the livelihoods of the Shia population, because they never had anything before that. It's also because they fight with Israel. And because they're a thorn in Israel's side. That's why even a lot of Maronites and a lot of Christians like Hezbollah in Lebanon, or they have sympathies just for that reason. But if there is no ground invasion from Israel and Hezbollah doesn't get to pose as the defender of Lebanon, they don't get to have the same propaganda wins that they had in 2006, then that could make things deteriorate for them. So I haven't seen any sign of that happening on a large scale, but if they are shown to be ineffective, I think that is long-term going to be something that's quite damaging to them.
All right.
Well, last week I said it was very unlikely that either Israel or Hezbollah were interested in escalation, and then look what happened. So let's not make any predictions, okay? Maybe France will invade Germany for some reason.
Hopefully not. All right. Well,
all right, take care, man.